welcome and thank you for coming this afternoon to share in a conversation with Jean. And as Donald mentioned, unfortunately, Jean can't be with us this afternoon. We went and saw her at 1 o'clock this afternoon and she said, I'm going to come, but I've got to listen to my body. So that's Jean's message for today. You have to listen to your body. And her body has just taken her off to hospital. So Jean's been really, really well. But about a week or so ago, she periodically suffers from low blood pressure and low iron. And I mean really low iron. So she had to go and have an iron transfusion about a week ago. And unfortunately that didn't work well. And so Jean, being the soldier that she was, actually got the vial of iron that the doctor couldn't insert into her, took it home, and then got herself to PA, and where she had the iron infusions. And she does really recover very well after the iron infusion. Unfortunately today, she's got an upset tummy, and that's no good, so she won't be with us. And she's very sorry she can't be with us. It was always a two-edged sword, this whole conversation with Jean. One week you'd go and talk to her and she'd say, yes, I'm really enthusiastic about this, and you can say that. And then the following week she'd say, oh, I'm not too sure I'm going to do this at all. So, but it's a conversation that's been growing in our minds and our hearts for some months. Particularly every time we celebrated Jean's birthday, and I remember her celebrating her 99th birthday, and we were asking her stories about where she came from, and so we started to pick up stories, and we have gathered stories, particularly over the last year as we went closer to her 100th birthday, which was on the 25th of January this year. So what we'll do this afternoon is we've taken the opportunity to transcribe those conversations with ourselves and friends, and it's great to see some of her close friends here today to join us. And if we get anything wrong, I'm sure Anne or Min Ying will correct us. You'll correct us. So, but it is, as we got to know Jean, we realised that she is a living treasure, living amongst us. There's not many people that get to 100, but more importantly, get to 100 with such a sharp mind and a wonderful wit and a real personality. She is a character of significant extremes. And what we hope to do with this conversation is to describe her unique story, which really transverses. Her journey has gone from the depths of the Depression through the Second World War into the post-war experience where she was working in Glebe, living in Glebe, and then she moved to Piermont. So she's collectively had 50 years living in Glebe and nearly 35 years living in Piermont. So she is a true local, and she was here before it all changed. And my wife, I should introduce the alter ego of Jean today will be Mary. So the format of today's discussion, or this conversation, is that I'm going to ask a series of questions which I asked to Jean, and Mary is going to give a very good impression as she goes of Jean's responses. Just as some background on Jean, so as I mentioned, Jean was born on the 25th of January 1923. She was the fifth of 9 children. They lived in Leichhardt. And Jean, of course, is the only one standing. They've all gone. The most recent sibling to die was 14 years ago. And that was Betty, and she did live with Jean and a niece in Ways Terrace, but more of that later. So, but the family consisted of the eldest brother, Jimmy. Jimmy was born in 1915. He died in 1984. Then came Sister Dolly, and she was born in 1917. So it's a pattern here. Every 2 years we'll have a new child. Davy in 1919. Kathleen, her favourite sister, 1921. Jean was born in 1923. Then we had Betty, 25. Jackie, 27. And of those last two, Jackie only, sorry, I should go on. Then there was Peggy. Charles was the last to be born in 1930. So Charles lived for 2 years. He was actually, I think he was what's the word? The Down syndrome child. And Peggy only lived for 12 years. So that's the background. 9 children. Jean was the 5th. They were born in Leichhardt. So I asked Jean, one of the first questions I asked her is, well, what were your earliest memories? You know, what can you remember? And Jean, what do you say?
They tell me that the early years before the Depression were okay. I don't remember those years in the 1920s. My eldest brother Jimmy, born in 1915, certainly got the best education, and he even got to learn Irish dancing, which he loved. We all lived in a small rented house in Leichhardt, but things got really worse with the Depression in 1929-1930. With 8 children by 1929, my mother, Rose Elizabeth, was really struggling with mental health. Her youngest child, Charles, died in 1932. My father, James, was working with the New South Wales Railways and was often away in the country for more than 4 weeks at a time.
So then we changed the slide. We moved from a picture of Jean, who we describe as our superstar and the people's hero, and that's a picture taken at her birthday party at St Bede's 4 days after she turned 100, so she was 104 days. Now we have a generic photo. I went through Jean's photos, but we didn't have any depression photos, so I pulled something off the internet. But I actually like this photo because it, I think, captures the issues of the Depression. In fact, they were large families, often a lot of single mothers, and the issues were that no one had any money and everybody had a lot of anxiety. And I think they were the two issues that really overshadowed the Depression. So then I asked the question to Jean, well, okay, we all heard about the Depression, but how bad was the Depression for you?
Well, we were very poor and often very hungry. Our cupboards were bare. We generally only had 1 meal a day, and sometimes that was just bread fried and dripping. It got so bad that my brother at one time had to go to Lewisham Hospital after school with a suitcase to collect the unused porridge. We ate it cold, but were grateful to have something to eat. We slept on calico sheets. We had no pillow slips, and the blankets were so thin you could shoot peas through them. But there were some good times. I remember walking over the bridge when it opened on the 19th of March, 1932. I was 9, and my dad was a signalman with the railways on the bridge at the time. We had occasional trips to Katoomba, thanks to his free rail pass, and I still remember climbing up 1,000 steps out of the Megalong Valley.
So coming out of that, the first and biggest and probably most significant crisis for the family was Jean's mother's health. She clearly was not coping by the early 1930s, and some of the children were sent away for care. From 1931, Jean spent most of her time living with relatives, foster homes, and finally she ended up in the Scarborough Home for Girls. By 1937, her mother had suffered a complete breakdown, and was in the early stages of dementia, and she was admitted to the notorious Cullen Park. So again, I have a generic picture of Cullen Park. For those who know, Cullen Park was known as the Hospital for the Insane up until 1915. And although it was renamed the Cullen Park Mental Hospital thereafter, it certainly carried a stigma in the community. And I remember as a child in the 1950s shivering at the name of Cullen Park, because that was the home of insane people, and you didn't want to be one of those. But Jean's mother ended up in Cullen Park in 1937. So I asked Jean, how bad was your mother's health? What can you remember about Cullen Park and the consequences of a mother being in Cullen Park?
Well, after she was admitted to Cullen Park, Kathleen, Dolly and myself used to visit her every week for about 1 or 2 hours. That was in 1937, 1938. We were met in a big, cold waiting room by a stern-looking nurse with a big belt carrying lots of keys. My mother sadly never said anything. She just sat there and stared during our visits. After 18 months of this, one of the doctors realised the negative impact it was having on us children and strongly advised that we don't come anymore. He was right.
And this is a picture of Jean and her sister Kathleen. Kathleen was, well, you're supposed to guess it. Jean's on the left and Kathleen's on the right. And Kathleen was 2 years older than Jean, and Jean always spoke so fondly of Kathleen as being a most beautiful person who never found ill in anybody. And I think the words were that she was living in the wrong century. She should have been in a more gentler period in the 20th century. Anyway, we move on.
My sister Kathleen, who was 2 years older than me, born in 1921, was blonde, soft and gentle. But she had a breakdown in 1939 at the age of 18 and was also admitted to Cullen Park for treatment. I can only guess at what the treatment was like. I recall my brother-in-law, Ronnie, being a wardsman, saying that patients were only trouble when they went off their medication. But Kathleen recovered and went on to work at Bonds for over 30 years. She remained a beautiful, gentle person who always saw the best in people. She died at 63 with cancer in the bladder and early onset Parkinson's disease.
So the children didn't see their mother much after 1937, after 1938, after the doctor advised them not to come. And then I asked Jean, well, what happened to your mother? When did she die?
We didn't see much of my mother after 1938. She was to have shock treatment, but that got delayed when the war came, and then it was considered too late. She died 16 years later in Bladesville in 1953. I was 30 when Kathleen and I were called to see her. We arrived when she apparently had just died. There was no preparations for our visit. She looked truly shocking. I remember her mouth being open and she was very grey. I went into shock at the sight of her. I couldn't eat for 3 days and suffered illnesses that had me off work for a year. I was sure that my illness was due to the shock of my mother at her death. I found it very hard to understand and accept.
Then we went back and revisited their experiences Jean had at foster homes and living with relations. As a reminder, she was fostered out from 1931 at the age of 8. And I said, tell us a bit about the experiences of you being fostered out. Did you feel lonely? Did you miss your family? what was it like?
Well, Betty, Jackie and I, that's the 6th, the 7th and the 5th, were farmed out to various care homes from around 1931, when I was 8. One disastrous experience had us staying with some ladies in Epping. They were paid to look after us. On visitation days, we were presented to our father as well-dressed and well-fed, whereas we were really suffering malnutrition. We were allocated household jobs, including the starting of the fuel stove in the early morning. One morning it wouldn't start, so in our desperation we poured kerosene on the fire. It's a wonder we didn't blow the house up. My older sister Dolly, however, sensed something was not right, and she used to check on our welfare unannounced and eventually discovered our mistreatment. After that, Jackie, Dolly and I, at 10 years old, were placed temporarily in the Scarborough Home for Girls. We ended up staying 18 months, and ironically that was a very happy time for me. The relief of having someone else look after me was wonderful. This was also the first time that I got a Christmas gift. I'd never had a Christmas or a birthday gift or cake before that.
Here's a picture of Jean's father, affectionately known as Dada, who was quite distinguished for a railway man with his bow tie, which he apparently wore quite frequently, and his 1930s glasses, which I think look pretty cool. And of course, on the right-hand side is a picture of Jean from the 1930s, looking also pretty snazzy in a beautiful coat. Jean, hey? That's Jean. That's Jean. No. That's sadly, Jean doesn't have a picture of a mother. She never had a picture of a mother. I asked for that, and it just doesn't exist. So that was Jean in the 30s. So the question then this prompted was that obviously the mother's illness in the 30s was quite tragic for the family. The children being posted out to foster parents. I said, how did your father react to this? What do you remember of your father?
Dada was a great and gregarious man. He ended up being both our mother and our father. He was a true labour man. He loved and admired Jack Lang and Ben Chipley. He often sat in the park and talked to anybody who would listen. He loved his church and provided a refuge for the young priests. They would come to our home in Glebe and sit and talk and drink with him and watch our newly installed TV and its cowboy shows. My dad was a generous man, even though he didn't have much. He used to get the Herald every day and read it, eventually turning to the obituaries and proudly proclaiming that he was not dead yet because it wasn't in the paper. He worked on the railways until he was 65. Later, he got Parkinson's disease, but died of throat cancer at the age of 88, after being only 3 weeks in the Calvary Hospice.
After Jean lived at the Home for Girls, which she was only supposed to go there for a couple of months and stayed 18 months, and as she said, it was one of the happiest experiences of her life, ironically, because she didn't have to worry about herself. After that, she went and lived with her fraternal grandparents, Granny Mulligan. I'm going to ask the question, well, what do you remember of your grandparents?
Well, times were still tough. We lived in a rented 3-bedroom house, but it was shared by 3 families. The neighbours were kind and generous and helped with food and clothes. I fondly recall every night my very Irish Granny Mulligan gathering us all to say the rosary, and after that, with a glass of stout in her hand, she would tell stories of leprechauns and devils and Irish folklore. But I loved it. By that stage I had started to read widely at night, often by candlelight. My erratic education at a range of schools that finished in 1937, I was always thankful for being able to read. That is what saved or made my education.
So after the grandparents, Jean and her sisters rented a room in Stanmore, and they all started work. So this was Kathleen and Dolly were working at the Bonds factory at Camperdown, and Jean worked at the silk knit factory in Glebe. She tells the story about they would regularly pay their Irish landlord on a Friday afternoon the rent, and often be going back to the same landlord on Monday, borrowing the money back to buy food. She recalls that even though they were working, they were still poor, and she relates that, I said to her, she was walking home in the rain, getting wet, and I said, didn't you own an umbrella? And she said, no, we were clearly too poor to own umbrellas. In fact, what they have, so that when it rained, they were out in their coats, and when they came home, that meant at night, they used their coats as their eiderdown, so they had to sleep under wet coats. So things were tough. But after 18 months at Stanmore, the three girls, they all moved back to Glebe Point Road, the whole family, and they moved into Welby Flats. So the whole family were back together after 6 years of disruption and disconnection. Still pretty tight though. 5 girls were in one bedroom, and the 2 boys, which included the father, slept on a closed veranda. And they lived in this rented apartment in Glebe for the next 30 years. As time moved on, obviously things got a little better. And in 1968, they moved across the road to opposite the Valhalla Theatre into a 2-bedroom, more comfortable apartment. And they lived there for another 15 years. So I then moved on to, well, okay, Jean, you started work at 14. What was work like? How did you get there? What was your travel story?
Well, yes, I started work at the age of 14. I used to catch a train to Central, walk up to Riley Street to the Surrey Hills factory. I worked from 8 o'clock in the morning to 5:30 at night, 6 days a week with overtime. I had part-time jobs as well. Every Friday I would sell chocolates in the milk bar at the Empire Theatre at interval. I also worked at the Lyric Theatre in George Street and the State Theatre in Market Street. My wages were shared with everyone in the household for rent, food and bills. I didn't have much money for myself, but I did like clothes. I would buy them using lay-by. I remember it took me a year to pay off a beautiful blouse at 5 pennies a week for a total cost of £2.50. My love of clothes and dressmaking has stayed with me all my life.
Then in 1939, war came suddenly. Declared on the 3rd of September 1939 when Germany invaded its neighbouring countries. And Jean was 16. 2 years later, as we all know, the war came to the Pacific when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor without warning on the 7th of December 1941. Jean was 19. And it even came closer when Japan attacked Darwin on the 19th of February 1942. Next were midget submarines, as we heard about here in the Piedmont History Group. The Japanese submarines attacked Sydney Harbour on the 29th of May 1942, and we did hear about subsequent shellings from the mother submarines on Sydney Harbour, on the Sydney suburbs, particularly in eastern Sydney suburbs. So the obvious question to Jean is that these are all pretty anxious and worrying times. What was the war like for you? And just to set the scene here, we've got American sailors in Sydney in 1944. Again, that's a generic photo. And moving over to the right, that's a picture of Jean in the war years. And that's a picture of George, which we'll talk about. So, Jean, what do you remember of the anxiety and what was life like during the wartime?
It was very worrying times, especially in 1942, as the Japanese army rapidly moved toward Australia. But we were comforted by the US support in the defence of Australia. We 3 girls befriended American servicemen who liked to come to our home to share the comfort of home life and baked meals. The Americans would sometimes stay overnight, preferring to sleep on our floor rather than their hotel beds. The horrors of the Coral Sea battles seemed to haunt them, and they took comfort in the familiarity of a home. We often went dancing at Rose's night bar and did the jitterbug at the Trocadero. My dad used to come along too, not so much as a chaperone, but to also have a good time. He was very proud of his daughters. My sister Betty went out with a Marine, Dolly with an American soldier, and I, although a shy girl, went out with an American sailor called George Staley from Houston, Texas. George was in the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, and I really felt the war trauma through his stories.
So Jean, you spent company with George for 2 years. How serious did it get?
Yes, he did bring me nylon stockings, and we got engaged without a ring in 1944 when I was 21. He wanted to take me home to Houston and live on a farm. But I was a city girl, very practical, and had grown up a lot in the tough 30s. I didn't want to leave Australia, and I didn't want to live on a farm. So sadly, nothing happened. After that, there was much disruption, and there were not a lot of spare blokes. Kathleen, my brother Davey, and I never married. My calling was to look after and mind the other children. But you know, I never regretted it.
Now we've got a picture here of Dolly's wedding in the 1950s. And sorry, the picture didn't come out that well, but it shows the most important character in this picture was the bridesmaid, the very pretty bridesmaid on the right. And she made the wedding dress and her own dress. She loved dressmaking, and she's pretty good at it, Jen. So after the war, things seemed to get better. The family was still living in Glebe. There were weddings and family gatherings. Jean had a great love of going to the beach. She used to go to Bronte and Coogee. She noted that Bob Rogers was on the radio. I got this right. And she never learned to swim. That's right. So she used to go to the beach and she never learned to swim. However, in 1948, her brother Davey shared a lottery win. He won £6,000. So Jean, tell us about Davey's lottery win.
Well, first of all, we had a big party to celebrate. We spent about £1,000. It was a good party. But we also decided to buy some land for an eventual home for £4,000. After 6 years, we sold it. We didn't have the money to build, and Kathleen was getting sicker. We got £16,000 for the land. Davey got $8,000, and my sister and I shared the rest. It was a great and only windfall that filled a lot of financial gaps over the years.
Next part of the story is Jean started to work with Lawrence Dry Cleaners. And what we have here is a picture of Jean late in her career at Lawrence Dry Cleaners on the left. And the right, we have a picture of Glebe Point Road in the 70s. Now again, I couldn't get a picture of the original Lawrence dry cleaning shop. Apparently it was just down from the current Vinnie shop opposite Foley Park. But I showed this picture to Jean and she said, yeah, that's a pretty accurate impression of what life was like in Glebe Point Road in the 70s. Not that flash. So Jean, Lawrence Dry Cleaning became an important part of your working life. When and why did you start Lawrence Dry Cleaning?
Well, it was 1962 when I started working for Lawrence Dry Cleaners, and I stayed with them for 31 years. The last 8 years, I managed the shop in Glebe Point Road, just up from the current Vinnie's, opposite Foley Park. Foley Park was named after Dr. Foley, who was still alive at the time. When he died in 1989, he was described as a wonderful bloke and a fabulous doctor who will be remembered as a champion of the underdog and the worker. He was the working class hero for poor Glebe. Running the Lawrence Dry Cleaning shop, I got to know everybody in Glebe. I loved it and I was good for business. I even managed to get good paper runs for my nephews using my contacts.
And Jean, I understand that during your experience working at Lawrence Dry Cleaners, Alan Jones was one of your clients while he lived in Broadway. What do you recall of this doyen of the airways?
Well, his manservant brought a blue crepe shirt and a suit in one morning and wanted same-day service. Now that was a big ask. While dry cleaning the suit, I found $50 in one of the pockets. That afternoon, Alan Jones himself came in to pick up the dry cleaning, but strangely had no money. I then told him of the $50 I found and that he could pay for the dry cleaning with that. All I remember was being deflated in that there was little or no thanks for my honesty. He didn't seem to notice or care. But I loved being behind the counter. I loved meeting people, although at times it got weird.
You said weird, and I say, what sort of weird things could possibly happen at Lawrence Dry Cleaning?
Well, a young man wearing a nylon raincoat came into the shop on a Thursday night. I soon discovered he had a bayonet inside the coat and meant to rob the shop. Initially, he wanted me to lie down on the floor so he could tie me up. I strongly objected on account of my age and arthritis, which I didn't really have, so he only tied one leg to a stool. He took all the notes out of the till and $50 out of my purse, but left the $50 of loose change in the till. When I protested that I needed my money from my purse for my 3 kids at home, which I didn't have, he suggested that I take the loose change out of the till and say it was stolen. He left threatening me not to call the police. A passing friend saw my distress and took me home. The next day we went to the police. Nothing happened. Following day I was back at work. Anyway, soon after I retired at age 70, there was a big party with all my customers. Funnily, many brought pot plants as retirement presents. I had no room for pot plants in my apartment at Ways Terrace, so I gave them all to my supervisor, despite his limited help during the shop robbery.
So now we move on to Ways Terrace, and for those who don't know it, there's a picture of Ways Terrace in 1987, 2 years before Jean moved in. What distinguishes Ways Terrace is that it was a part of the Glebe Piermont City West housing that owned, again, you probably know most of these facts, owned 900 apartments and 20 buildings throughout central Sydney and Piermont, Ultimo and Forest Lodge and Glebe, including this famous Ways Terrace, which was completed in 1925. The building was designed by Leslie Wilkinson, who was Professor of Architecture at Sydney University, and it was clearly a beacon for social housing at the time. Wonderfully designed and still is today. And there Jean lived for quite a while. So the question then comes to Jean, well, why and when did you move to Pyrmont?
When I was 66, that's around 1989, I moved to Pyrmont to live at Ways Terrace. I moved in with Gail, my niece, and lived there for 25 years until Gail died. Betty, my sister, also lived there till she died. We shared a 2-bedroom apartment with 43 steps to the top floor. There were more internal steps to the bedroom. We were the only building on Point Street at that time. I had a great view from the apartment in Ways Terrace, overlooking the Harbour Bridge. I had extremely fond memories of the other residents and watched Pyrmont grow and transform around me in the 1990s and 2000s, including the development of the Star, Jones Bay Wharf and Darling Harbour.
So we moved to an aerial photo of Pyrmont in the 1980s, and Ways Terrace there has got the little red circle around it. So you can see it was very strategically located to see how Pyrmont changed dramatically over the next 25 years that Jean lived there. At the time she moved in, there were still boats and at berths. The Pyrmont Power Station stood where the Star was going to stand, and most of the industrial facilities and buildings were still there. So it must have been an amazing experience living in Ways Terrace over that period, seeing the change.
I liked it all, especially Darling Harbour and the Star. We used to host many lunches and dinners, including those for priests who served in the Glebe and Pyrmont areas. But there were still plenty of squatters in those days in the area, stealing electricity from the overhead lines and protesting. There was a well-known spokesman for our building, Otto Kruger, who was a historian advocate for Pyrmont and was a great representative of the people's concerns.
And we move on to this picture, which is actually a view from Jean's current apartment in Bowman Street. It's one on the 4th floor, looks out over Pyramid Park and the occasional boat that comes to visit. So I went on to say, in 2013, Jean, you moved into your current apartment, a wonderful space, had a lift, had no stairs and a great view of White Bay and the cruise ships. You've been there for 10 years now, and you live by yourself, you're very active, you still go to church at St. Bede's and St. Peter Julian at Haymarket. You're very generous with your money, supporting your nieces and the homeless. You're actually a legend amongst the homeless because you never pass a homeless person without speaking to them. You go to the Star quite regularly, often after Mass, and you have an amazing, significant credit built up in your poker machine account over these many years, reputedly to be about $8,000, which you share with those in need. You continue to navigate Sydney transport quite independently. You work out where all the hills and bumps are, and of course your main concern is not falling over. So Jean, you've got to 100. You said you wouldn't do it. You said you'd die the day before. And here's your 100th birthday cake, which we celebrated at St. Bede's. So finally, could you give us the secrets of your long life? But more importantly, to long life, that very healthy and active and independent mind, which still has incredibly sharp wit.
Well, I have my faith, my independence, very important to me, and my sense of humour. I have beautiful friends that care for me and I for them. I have been saying the rosary with Sister Margaret and others every month for over 35 years in Pyrmont Glebe houses, and the tradition still continues. It keeps us grounded and connected with the great struggles in life many people face. It is a great comfort to say the rosary. I try to keep active and mobile. Falling is my biggest fear, and the occasional disruption that I had to my health like last week. So I wish you all good health, good friends, and a good laugh. Thanks for listening to my story. It's always good to remember where we came from.
So Jean's not here, but we'll try and answer the questions. More importantly, Moon Ying or others, Mary, will they've got any questions about Jean? Any good stories about Jean? We'd love to hear them.
Sorry, just telling the story that I think my wife, she thinks it was Jean that she helped. She just talked about falling when she fell getting on the bus or off the bus and waiting for an ambulance. But why did she move from Ways Terrace to Bowman Street?
A good question. She moved. She was in a 2-bedroom apartment in Ways Terrace. She was living with her niece and her sister Betty. Betty died first, then her niece died, and then so Jean was alone in a 2-bedroom apartment. And I think the city housing said maybe we should move into something smaller. Howard, actually, you were there before, weren't you?
But because there was no lift up there,
Yes.
that was the main reason for moving.
Yeah.
And so it was great that she came to United Care. Yeah.
I mean, she never lost a sense of humour, because when she went last Saturday to PA, like, it was pretty traumatic for her. She'd been to the doctor at the local to have this injection, and the doctor couldn't find her veins on the Thursday. So it was a terrible experience. But she got up and went to the PA, and I think everywhere she goes now, she's got the celebrity of being a 100-year-old. And I think these nurses were coming and saying, "Are you really 100? You don't look 100." And then someone came in and related, "Oh, well, I had my relation live to 100, and he smoked 2 packets of cigarettes a day. And actually, when he died, we put 2 packets of cigarettes on the coffin." And as sharp as a tack, Jean said, "Well, did you leave him a lighter? There's no good without a lighter." And they all thought that was pretty funny. I thought it was too.
And she said, you know, my 100th birthday is coming up now, and that King of England is going to send me a telegram, and I don't want that, she said. She said, but if it was from the Pope, that would be different. So of course I got my thinking cap on, and I wondered how I could manage to do that. So to make a long story short, I got the blessings from the Vatican, and it was delivered by DHL with the Vatican's coat of arms on the left-hand side and the address on the back. So they couldn't fool me that it came from anywhere else. It definitely came from So that made me do.
I thought it was funny that Mary said the letter came from the Vatican with a seal, and the delivery man was a Filipino, and Mary told him, you know, this has come all the way from Rome, from the Pope, you know, so he felt very blessed himself for delivering this letter.
And we're still waiting for King Charles to come to it.